Welcome, everyone, to the Walker Art Center and the Walker Cinema. My name is Pablo De Ocampo. I'm the director and curator of Moving Image here at the Walker. As we often do, I'll just begin tonight by welcoming you and acknowledging that the Walker Art Center sits on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary homelands of the Dakota. The Dakota, as I hope you all know, are the stewards, original inhabitants of the area that we all live in here in the Twin Cities, and who do still live in this area today, but of course were forcibly removed, kind of pushed out to other parts of the state, other parts of the country, through a system of treaties, broken treaties, other sort of dispossession and land displacement that happened throughout the 19th century and 20th century. I want to welcome you tonight to a program called what is this program called? Cinema is of the Mind. Anyway, with the artists Tiffany Sia and Jordan Lord. This is a program that I'm really excited to do, and you're going to see a few things that might be different than when you're at a normal screening. And what is a normal screening? I don't know if we always necessarily have those here, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of context of what we're doing tonight, where this sort of came from, and some of the things you'll see. We've done some other programs with Jordan Lord. You may have come to something of his a couple of years ago, a film called Shared Resources, a feature that he made that we showed here at the Walker a couple of years ago. And the program that we're doing tonight is very much an outgrowth of that. Sometimes you see these things referred to up on the screen, like in previews and things, called like cinema residencies. Sometimes those are a bit more compact and sort of like discernible and legible as like a series or something that you might like see over the course of a couple of weeks. Other times they really happen through slow time. And our engagement with Jordan is very much in that sense. And this program that we're here for tonight grew out of some conversations that developed with a screening 2 years ago that really centered on questions of accessibility in the moving image, how moving images are accessed and understood, and how we engage with them as audiences, different kinds of audiences at different times. And that question of access, of how we read images, spurred a different conversation that took accessibility out of maybe things like ASL or things like captions that we're kind of used to thinking of as mechanisms of support that kind of help different types of audiences with different experiences in the world see and understand images. But it maybe asks a larger question about what images are and how we understand them and who they're for, how accessibility is one way to kind of make legible or make visible or make audible images that might not necessarily be accessible to certain audiences. And this question, I think, in this program tonight is trying to ask those same questions, but maybe more broadly around media literacy or around instances where images are kind of held back for other reasons, political or otherwise, that they might not necessarily be accessible to all. So, rundown for tonight. We're going to watch about an hour of films. There's 3 of them in total. An Image on Air by Tiffany Sia, which will start the program, a very short 2-minute video, which you've already been watching for the last however long you've been in this cinema on this little lovely screen here, but we're now going to watch it in a bit more focused way. We will then watch An All-Around Feel-Good by Jordan Lord and conclude with A Child Already Knows by Tiffany Sia. About an hour at the end, we'll be joined by the artists up on stage here for a little bit of conversation. Maybe we'll have time to have a Q&A. If not, we'll be in the lobby. I'll see you when the screening's done. Thanks. Hello, welcome everyone again. Thanks for being here. I'm going to start by just doing a couple things that I forgot to do at the beginning, just in the interest of the various levels of translation that are happening tonight. One is to sort of acknowledge what you just noticed. So at the end of Tiffany's second film that we watched, we had ASL for the audio that was happening. I meant to, at the beginning, indicate that would be happening, and also to sort of say that the soundtrack is continuous throughout, the sound of kind of clattering, whirring train sounds, and that also introduced myself that I am a short middle-aged man wearing several different shades of indigo denim with black graying hair and glasses, and I'm seated around a table now with Tiffany and Jordan. Tiffany's directly to my left, and then Jordan to Tiffany's left. Our ASL interpreters are off to my right, and we're seated just below the screen that has our names and the title of the program here. We're going to begin by I think it's helpful when we're kind of watching different things by different people at different times to just take a moment to say who you are and what we looked at, and maybe contextualize just what you shared with us today, just so we can all remember and ground where we are. So I'm going to kick that to Tiffany to start us off.
Yeah, I guess I'm Tiffany Sia, artist and filmmaker. I have a short bob, wearing all black. An Asian woman in my 30s. An image on air, actually, I've never shown this way. This is an experiment, which I was really quite thrilled and excited about, and is probably closer to what I had intended originally for the piece. This piece was actually a little plaque, if you can remember what Fred Rogers says about the little plaque on his desk. And it was installed in a gallery window that faced the street. And so it was sort of captioning this imaginary scene while the window basically gets turned into a screen unto itself, like a kind of live cinema. But I had always thought deeply about what that looks like in this kind of captioning and subtitling in operas, and how they either typically sit at the top of the theater or on the side, or actually like right in front of your seats. So it kind of gets enlivened in a very different way in the cinematic context. And then A Child Already Knows is a film I made using appropriating early Mao era animations and kind of putting them together in juxtaposition with my father's memories as a child.
Hi, I'm Jordan Lord. This is Jordan speaking. I'm a white person with a shaved head and a mustache. I'm wearing a checked button-down shirt and a floor-length gray skirt. I'm really happy to be here with Tiffany and Pablo. This is kind of a dream to see these works together because in a lot of ways, the piece, An Image on Air, is kind of mapping out this space that An All Around Feel Good was kind of first inspired by, trying to think about. The kind of weird aspect ratio, which ordinarily looks like a kind of U shape, although what's cool is actually like the curtains came to kind of cover up part of the black on either side, but there's still a U shape, is kind of thinking about this space that we ordinarily think of as kind of external to the frame, but that also kind of creates the possibility of formatting for different media, but also is sometimes where, you know, the captions will go in a film. I have, for the last like decade or so, worked with description as, access, like description and captioning as kinds of fundamental to the image as well, and thinking about how these things, both because of, you know, how labor gets organized in a film production, but also you know, how these things are valued. Access features are often kind of seen as external to the film rather than as integral to it. But this kind of conundrum, which also then became a kind of aesthetic resource, came up of thinking, okay, so, you know, what happens when a film has burnt-in captions in English, but we also want to show it in another language, or have subtitles in addition to the captions that would translate them. And so, you know, the film kind of tries to imagine this extra space. Obviously, the film's doing a bunch of other things, but at least, you know, germane to this conversation, a lot of what I was super excited about with this piece is thinking about that. You know, and then maybe just to say that this film kind of came out of research for a feature-length film that was really just kind of like, okay, I have this archival material that I kind of play the audio from, these different kind of charity videos about, you know, this veterans advocacy organization that awarded me a scholarship for kind of doing a specific type of patriotic speech when I was 17. But that a lot of what they kind of now perform as their kind of charitable mandate actually has a lot to do with kind of questions of disability and about, both kind of disabled veterans, the idea of helping disabled veterans, quote unquote, as like an intrinsically good thing, regardless of what that help might look like or what help might be needed. And then, and often that help looking like putting people to work. And I was very perplexed by these images, both because I was like, well, how do these things go into this larger film that it feels it's very fundamental to, but also how can I actually watch these things with an audience and get them to feel what I feel when I watch them, which is like sheer horror and kind of just this kind of like, wow, this tells me kind of everything I need to know about, how disability is valued, how disabled labor is valued, how veterans and disability kind of get fused. But I know that the audiences it's intended for have exactly the opposite experience of how I watch it. And so the film kind of came out of this experiment of like, well, what framework or structure might I need to then actually ask this audience to, see this with me the way that I experience it.
I wonder if there's like a kind of a very loose, wide starting point to ask both of you would be to maybe respond a bit to the idea of translation and making images and what that means. Because just as you're sort of outlining there, Jordan, there is this way that you as an artist are both stewarding, molding, changing, shaping, arranging images, and that maybe being an act of translation. But then this other thing that you're kind of pointing at, the sort of like the way that audiences receive those images can be very different at different times, and what those sort of thoughts about trying to translate ideas through images may mean, or translate images into words, as is happening here, translate stories and histories into other images that aren't necessarily the images that are associated directly with that.
Yeah, I feel like with my work and beyond this film, I've thought a lot about translation, and translation as being always a partial process, right? Even in an attempt to translate something, you have to prioritize the meaning of something, and by prioritization, there's always something that falls out of frame and doesn't get described. And it's also for brevity, right? To fit exactly in that space that you're talking about. My first film, Never Rest Unrest, has no subtitles at all, and it's a mix of English and Cantonese and Mandarin. I grew up in a multi-dialect home, so my dad spoke Hokkien, Shanghainese, Mandarin, and Cantonese, and we spoke Cantonese at home. And he used my parents used Hokkien and Shanghainese to talk about family secrets or about money. So there was also something funny about kind of like almost making out what they were saying and not making out what they were saying, and constantly always being left in the dark through language, and like being kind of used to that, I think. In my personal, like daily life, that I sort of like putting audiences in that space of the unknowing. And of course, in this story, this particular period is translated, I guess, metaphorically, into this memory of a child. This highly contentious period in modern Chinese history translated into these odd half-remembered scenes of my father being at the Chinese Soviet banquet hall eating ice cream. So, and again, kind of pointing to the partiality of partiality of knowledge. What does he know? And some of the more sensational facts about, what was occurring for my parents or for my grandparents at this time is kind of kept off screen. And I think broadly, I was just sort of interested in conveying knowledge through narrative and film, and how we know things and how we signal we know things, how we tell certain periods of history, how we talk about national memory, you know. In some ways, like, a child already knows, like, the title itself is a bit like Chinese pigeon. A child already knows. There's something almost grammatically, like, not super correct about it, like long time no see, you know? But I kind of liked that because there was almost like an allegorical, it's sort of anti-allegorical, but it's like this child remembers this thing. And actually the child was right. You see the found footage at the end. And there are the pens. There are the women with the, you know, stylized hair. There are all of these things that you know, the child is sort of seen as this unreliable narrator. But in that moment, it sort of reflects back at the child, like, oh, you know, there is something fundamental about what the child knows that adults can't refute. So, and I think as adults, what we're not prepared for children to know or admit that children know about certain things. And so, yeah, that's broadly translation, but I think translation and language as a medium in the family for revelations and secrets.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I actually want to answer this question partially by talking about your film too, Tiffany, because it's like it was really helpful for me to see these three videos together and think about what are they saying to each other, and also about what it means to read an image, and also, you know, how translation works, and also what we might be after in translation. So definitely this kind of term partiality, I think, is kind of at the core of how I think about access and its relationship to translation, both in the sense, of course, of like what Tiffany's talking about, that like when you're describing something, you're captioning something, you also then become aware of all of the things that are not captioned or that are partial, but also partial as in like kind of tending toward like being partial to, you know, like I have like a favorite kind of a thing. And I think that for me is about this kind of like how access, whether it's captioning, whether it's description, how these things are actually also doing a kind of reading, not only of the image, but also where the image comes from, right? Of the positionality of the image, of the positionality of the sound. I guess I actually want to say, because I think I have a tendency, especially because like description has been such a kind of like, it is like the first kind of thing I do when I start editing a film, is starting to describe the image, and then that kind of creates the logic of how I edit it. But I also think that, you know, I have a tendency to almost deprioritize sound in that regard. And a lot of what this work is also trying to think about is, you know, what is still really partial in the process of captioning, and how these partialities also reflect other politics, right? Like it's not just the politics of disability, but also the politics of how disability gets segmented off from other politics, right? Whether it's as simple as like, why do we talk about, you know, disability access separately from how we also talk about other forms of linguistic access or translation. So this is also another thing that the film is trying to think about, or why is there a kind of like, you know, affect around disability that allows it to be depoliticized around questions of labor, when it's like actually at the core of both how labor is defined in America, but also kind of questions of war, debilitation, all of these things. Sorry, my mind is kind of all over the place, but I'm not sure if my brain can get here, but where I actually wanted to go, at least in connecting it to your films, Tiffany, as well, is that I think another thing that I was actually trying to think about in terms of translation, or what is being translated here, or what is being read in the images here, is that it's like actually not about the images themselves or the sounds themselves, but rather the kind of world or system or regime that they come from, right? And a lot of how I experienced that watching A Child Already Knows this time, which I've seen this film like 5 times at this point, but it's the first time I really had this realization, is that I think a lot of what is happening there is about how you are kind of translating for us the experience of what this media kind of does to an audience or is used for, particularly like this child audience, right? Like these cartoons have a very privileged relationship, or that's the wrong way of putting it. These cartoons are there to also distract, right? Like they're about a kind of experience of distraction, of, and this is still like how cartoons are used today. We put on the cartoon so that Kyle will like be distracted from whatever else is going on in the house or whatever, right? But it's really fascinating to me watching A Child Already Knows, because it's like, I find myself having to like fight against distraction. Like it's like you both kind of show us like a kind of system, or translate for us a system in which like the images are not themselves, but rather this affect or this feeling of distraction, and then we have to kind of like snap ourselves back into the story in order to like actually follow what's going on, or kind of pick up on the pieces that you're leaving behind for us around your father's experience. But also it's of course not just your father's experience, it's also being told to us as us, right? You. So I don't know if that like is something to pick up on, but kinds of questions of distraction and distractive viewing as a kind of like national imperative behind media itself, I think is something that these works have in common. And so I kind of wanted to talk about that, because I think when we talk about translation or what we're trying to give access to, it often gets reduced to something like the image, which is not actually something that I'm interested in. And I think both of us also share this interest in the kind of like deprioritizing the image toward like, what does the image do? Or like, what is the image about? Like what is it being used for? Or what is it being put to work to do? So distraction. What do you think?
Yeah, no, there's also something about, I think, first of all, I think it's really interesting, this program, to put these two films in juxtaposition with one another, because it invites this very conversation, which is something I feel like we're sort of talking around the Cold War. We're talking around the ways in which these images belong to different infrastructures, and the ways in which, and you put it really concisely in your film, which is the words, how these images are put to work, how these images are put to use. And there's a genre of images that kind of fall with, whether the landscape, the shots of landscape that you're using, they kind of fall within this kind of American landscape genre as well. And you're sort of working, but also interrogating that formally by creating so much black space within the kind. There's like this sort of existing letterboxing where the image is like bumped up, and then there's that big space for the captioning, and then also potentially the subtitles as well. But then there's also, you begin with the nested image. You begin with the nested image on the plane, and like a series of nested images. So we know we're invited to already come to this question about us as audiences. And we already are coming to this question of us as audience, like being fixed in a seat in a plane that we can't get out of until the plane lands and we deplane legally. So there are like all these ways in which you're thinking about the kind of arrested figure of the cinema goer, of the spectator, of this passive viewer. And the ways in which these things are put to work. I mean, when I was pulling these early Mao cartoons, and when I show them in a North American context, for instance, they have this very particular uncanny quality. There's something that's evocative of Disney. There's something that's evocative of Hanna-Barbera cartoons. And that's not a coincidence, because that was also an early time of propaganda, so it wasn't so kind of made into the sort of more iconic, canonical sort of like Mao era propaganda. They're almost bourgeois in nature, because they're just so, but they have some sense of some vague sense of moral tales also at play. But and as I was doing research, there was also something really interesting that I uncovered. Mao's wife and some of the elite cadres would have these screenings among the elite cadres that were called internal reference films. And those internal reference films were basically, they would watch Hollywood films. They would watch Western films.
Right, yeah.
For internal reference only. So there's this funny way in which the circulation of these materials, video as material, moving image as material, is this kind of like powerful tool and weapon, right? And this use of influence in different ways, to be coercive, to be convincing, to be lulling, And so I think that there's so much in that line by itself, this idea of when images are put to use. I mean, even images of the soldiers lying in that landscape and in that training as well. And you're constantly putting us in a place where we can have some kind of distance from it, whether the kind of letterboxing, or also I think that there's something about the voiceover, the constant voiceover and the constant text that forces the viewer to reckon with these terms at every stage, So there's it's interesting because I mean, also broadly, I'm thinking about the feel good too, and I'm kind of interested to talk to you about the title, the all-round feel good kind of as a genre, as a kind of American Cold War export. And also something that like is so powerful that it is that there are attempts to recreate it in other contexts, but there is certainly nothing like the American feel good.
Yes, most definitely. Yeah, no, and I mean, it's exactly what I was hoping that we could talk about in a way, because it's like, it's both the American feel good, but it's like also just this idea of like media being used to produce a kind of compulsory feeling, right? That like, if you don't feel this feeling, then there's like something wrong here, right? Like you are not actually part of the audience that this thing was intended for. Like somehow you have become outside of it, right? And I think because I'm disabled and I think about disability, I think about this is like how this is kind of something disabled audiences are always contending with, is like this isn't really for you, but also like how I do think like it's it's a deeply American project to use the image as a tool of being like, this is for everybody. Read American, read like the ones that we think are good, right? Like you are good for feeling good. Like there's this kind of like recursive loop that happens there. And, of course, a lot of what this film is dealing with is kind of like the charity model of disability and how this is something that, has been all completely built around like how non-disabled people like extract kind of this aesthetic pleasure or something out of, feeling like they're being helpful to disabled people. But I do think it's also a kind of nationalistic project that goes beyond disability actually doesn't go beyond disability. Like disability is really at the heart of it, but it's like, it builds this kind of circuit so that disability actually becomes like invisible at the center of all of it. So that it's like this question of, like if you don't feel good watching this, like what's wrong with you? Like that's kind of a lot of what I'm interested in about the feel good. And I guess I'm curious, if that's something that you have a parallel reference for, like it is this kind of Cold War thing, right? Like I guess, yeah, I want to speak to that first and then kind of turn it back over to you of like, it's really interesting to think about how that never really went away, right? That, this really easy thing to pull out of anti-American, which feels like a very kind of like, there's a part of my brain that's like, that feels really old, but I remember hearing it all the time growing up, like, in the 9/11 era. And then, now it's coming back out to describe, what it is to be pro-Palestinian is to be anti-American, like whatever, like insert here, to be trans is to be anti-American, like, it's about being a kind of like enemy of the state in relation. And I guess I'm curious about like how that's also produced like effectively, like if you don't feel like you're American, you're anti-American, and so I guess I'm curious about like if, how you see this kind of use of affect. Is it like a specifically American thing, or is it something that you've also been thinking about in, your work around China?
I think with Sinophone cinema, the affect is more around the melodrama. So there's also this kind of avoidance of the melodrama here, because I didn't want to be like, you should pity the child. The child is this protagonist of... the child is very complicated here. He's also not really listening, and he's sort of bad and gets told, there's like, there's a quality about the child that's not so like able to be pitied, or at least I was trying to really avoid some of those tropes of this. I think especially children presented in these kinds of spaces of really violent histories, terrifying histories, that like the audience is invited to feel some kind of sense of like pity. But I really actually wanted to kind of think more broadly about the child as like the child in all of us who remembers that moment of suddenly becoming aware of the world of adult secrets, and almost that as like a kind of like way to tell history in a different way. Not that we can always know something about a contentious period in history. In fact, it is always about how we can't know that makes it contentious. So I was kind of interested in that. But the affect part is interesting, because I think that there's something around affect and consensus. Because we can feel the same together, we can think the same together, and we're aligned, and there's a kind of like national feeling that can build from that. But there's also something funny about like presenting these two films in the sense of like really what was going on behind A Child Already Knows, the real narrative behind A Child Already Knows, kind of points to it. My grandfather suddenly sells his coat and he leaves. He was an enemy of the state. He was tortured for 2 years, but in a covert way, so not through one of these more kinds of public shaming campaigns as a rightist, which is really what started happening in the 50s and then really escalated in the 60s and the 70s during the Cultural Revolution. But what was so strange about it was that it was covert. So it wasn't again, this is like one of those things where there are very few family facts, so like I can only deduce. But what I feel like I can deduce is that why was it covert? If it was for ideological reasons, it would have been public. But clearly this was not for ideological reasons. So it was covert. And I'm interested in this way of like secret keeping and this and a kind of being covert around tactics of repression, tactics of coercion. They tried to get him to sign basically a false confession, which he refused to. But he was also a communist sympathizer. And he had friends in the founding members of he had friends who were among the founding members of the Communist Party, and he also had friends in the Nationalist Party. So there are a lot of weird questions that begin to sort of surface. But of course, this is like, this is one of many personal family stories that people have of the Chinese diaspora who leave. But we don't have a set of images around this. Instead, what we have is this strange, I went and I said, okay, what set of images can I use instead? I can use these animations from this time. But it's so strange that my father didn't watch them. And he seems to have been a child who had a lot of access to, at least he had access to the Chinese Soviet mansion where he ate ice cream. So why didn't he have access to a television to watch those cartoons? What I later then what I later found out, I mean, this actually happened in the exhibition, and the unfolding of the exhibition once I had installed it on a CRT monitor. Chinese diaspora, some of them were students, would come up to me, and they were born in the 90s and the 2000s, and they would say, I watched those cartoons. I remember those cartoons. Those were the ones that were played for me. And I was like, this is so strange. My father was like that. He was the era to have watched it, but he was like, I've never seen these. I was like showing it to him, and I was like, can you fact check all of these things? Like, I just want to make sure these intertitles capture your memory like well. And he was like, but I've never seen these cartoons. He just watched the Johnny Carson show and Laugh-In, which again, full circle, right? In terms of thinking about what images are put to use, and this is what he watched in Hong Kong. And so you think about these global syndicates of like TV programs, what is circulated, cheap American television programs that are sold to like other international global syndicates.
Yeah, and I mean, I will stop talking, I promise. But it's really interesting to think about that, right? Where I was thinking about, is kind of cinema, how this national project of like consensus building or something in an American context, like so much of that was aided through cinema, right? Like literally propaganda during the Cold War, but also, kind of from the get-go, this idea that we get to have this collective experience. The really interesting thing about it, of course, is that like cinema is something that crosses borders really easily, and there's a kind of really utopian aspiration to that, which I think, is a lot of my interest in access, is like this idea that, we could use this access, this ability to traverse borders as a way of abolishing them. But of course, there's another dimension to all of this, which is imperialism, right? Like using the ability to cross borders actually as a way of like, reproducing America, across borders, or, and vice versa, right? So I think that's something that's really interesting here at play. I was thinking a lot about that, but yeah.
And also the idea that you and I both know, I mean, we all know on this stage that when you apply to a film festival, you have to kind of state the nationality of your film. What is the nationality of A Child Already Knows? I don't really know.
Yeah, precisely.
Well, generally, that's, in the sort of larger world of film festival things, that means where the money came from.
Okay.
It does. I mean, if you look at if you look at an international film, it'll like sometimes you'll see a film that says like Germany, France, U.S. That means, it doesn't really mean who made it. It means who paid for it. But that doesn't necessarily apply here because there's very little money taking place in the production of these kinds of movies. We're getting close to time, and so I just want to be mindful of that. If I wanted to make an opportunity for anyone in the audience, if you had a burning desire to raise your hand and ask a question, a microphone can come to you. But we also don't need to do that if no one feels the need to publicly ask a question. But I'll take a moment to see if anyone raises their hand. Because there's also the invitation to just, when we exit this room, it's a very, collegial small group of ourselves here, and we can all talk in a more casual, informal way outside in the lobby. I see a couple hands go up, so let's do it. Let's start down here in the front. A microphone will come to you. Just wait 1 second.
For Tiffany, for your dad not seeing those animations, do you think there was like an effort for him, for images to not be worked on him, like if he was coming from a certain class that's not supposed to like receive those images? Is that there's an element of that? And yeah.
I would say probably no, just because my grandfather was a communist sympathizer, so I don't think he was like treating that is that what you mean? Like treating that kind of ideological, like images as sort of ideological, and like didn't want to pollute his son or something like that? Is that what you mean?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think it was just an access thing. Like, I don't think anybody had a television set. And what they ended up watching, well, to speak to this also, what they ended up watching was Soviet productions, the ballets, and these dances. So it was certainly of the socialist like cultural realm that he was. Besides, like, I guess he didn't watch television until he was 18, really, when they had a set. But in Shanghai, what he was exposed to as a child in terms of any like entertainment was Soviet productions.
Then maybe there was one other one up there. Yeah.
Thank you both. A question around these cartoons and working on them, well, working with the imagery. How did you not get swept up by the emotional narrative, like the propaganda? Because as I was watching them, it was very difficult to maintain a distance. I felt myself being pulled into what I can now critically call as, Bambi communist energy. But it was so seductive, I was enjoying the feeling of being seduced and feeling aggravated by the like critical voice of the child that already knows, the narrative that's interrupting that visual pleasure. How, as you're working on something like this, do you maintain that distance?
I don't know, maybe it's also like when you read the New York Times with a bit of distance. It's like all media, like, you have to encounter with some distance, and I feel like with those, there's certainly all these feelings exactly that you're talking about. The frog falling from the sky, there's this panic that you get. But it was also intentional on my part, and also probably coercive on my part, to weave some of these things into certain and time them with the intertitles, because the intertitles were about this like inevitable like departure, this kind of ongoing slow escape that was happening. And so there is this kind of playing of anticipation and dread that I'm weaving in that montage. So part of what that is playing with these images and where that intersects, or like when the wolf is chasing the rabbit, there's this kind of sinister feeling. And then that kind of dovetails with like, why is he selling his coat? What is this child? Like the opening scene is the child is in the pawn shop. What is the child doing in the pawn shop? So these types of things, and I'm making use of the images to my own ends in that sense.
Well, one last.
I have a couple of questions, but I'm just going to ask one for both of you. I guess, yeah, by the end of it, I was like, both of these have to do with fathers, although yours, Jordan, in a more oblique way and Tiffany's in a more open way. So I'm curious, Jordan, your father is not in this film in the way he's in some other films that you've made, but if you could both say briefly if you've showed these to your fathers. It sounds like you have shown it to your father, Tiffany, but I'm curious the father's reactions.
I haven't shown mine to my father because he's not in it.
Yeah, my dad's reaction was like, these are not my memories. Or the cartoons are not my memories, but the other parts, yes. Yeah. The father question is interesting. Because I feel like the Cold War and that, thinking about nationalism is exactly this good daddy, bad daddy energy.
Because do you think, are your fathers, do you know, are they a similar age?
49.
Yeah, my dad's 51.
Okay, well, I'll have more to ask later. Thank you.
Cold War Fathers is the next name of our the sequel to the series.
Join us in a couple years' time. We'll get it together.
It'll
The
be
Cold
called
War Fathers.
Good Daddy, Bad Daddy is the...
Future seasons in the moving image program at the Walker. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our interpreters. Thank you to our tech crew, Katie and Justin, up in the booth, making everything look and sound great. And thanks you all for coming and supporting, gathering together in the wonderful social space of the cinema. We'll be up in the lobby if you want to say hi or ask questions or chat. But I want to get out of this room. I'm really cold.